The day Gideon Ford rode into Harvest Creek with nothing but a borrowed horse, and a name he could barely stand to carry. The sky over the Texas Panhandle was the color of an old bruise, purple and yellow and threatening rain that never came. He had been a man of considerable standing, once 300 acres of cattle land north of San Antonio, a herd that numbered in the hundreds, 2 hired hands, and a reputation for fair dealing that stretched from the Rio Grande to the Oklahoma border. He had been a man who tipped his hat to women and meant it, who paid his debts before they were due, who believed, with the earnest and slightly foolish conviction of a man who had never truly suffered, that the world rewarded those who worked hard and kept their word. He had been wrong. The drought of 1878 had come first, baking the earth into plates of cracked clay that swallowed the roots of his grass and left nothing but dust and the memory of green. Then came the fever that swept through his herd in the autumn of that same year, killing 60 head in 3 weeks and leaving the rest gaunt and wild-eyed. He had borrowed from the bank in San Antonio to cover the losses, and the bank had sent a man named Clarence Doyle, who wore a silk cravat in the heat of September and smiled with the particular patience of a man who already knew the ending of every story he walked into. By the winter of 1878, the land was gone. The cattle were gone. The 2 hired hands, brothers named Pete and Arlo Marsh, had gone quietly, taking only their wages and leaving behind a politeness that was somehow worse than anger. The house had been sold to pay the remainder of the debt, and Gideon Ford had walked out of it on a gray December morning carrying a canvas sack, a Henry repeating rifle he had kept from the war, and the slow, stunned feeling of a man who has just watched his entire life board a train and pull away from the station. He was 31 years old. He had no family left to speak of. His mother had passed 4 years earlier, his father before that, and the brother who might have helped him had gone to California in 1872 and sent 3 letters before going quiet entirely. There was no one to turn to, no one to receive him, and the particular dignity that had always come naturally to Gideon Ford now had to be manufactured from scratch, assembled each morning like a piece of equipment, worn with careful deliberateness because the alternative was to let it show. The hollowness, the shame, the specific agony of a proud man brought to nothing. He had ridden north, following work where he could find it, spending 2 months in Abilene helping a livestock broker load and ship cattle, spending another month further west repairing fence line for a rancher who paid in meals and $1 a week. It was on that rancher's recommendation that he had ridden to Harvest Creek, a town of perhaps 400 souls sitting on the edge of the Caprock in the Texas Panhandle, where a man named Hector Burns was rumored to be hiring experienced ranch hands. He did not know, when he rode in on that bruised sky afternoon in the spring of 1879, that Harvest Creek would change his life. He did not know that he would stay. He did not know about Nora Lawson. He found the town in the state that many panhandle towns existed in that year, half-finished, ambitious, precarious. There was a main street with a dry goods store, a saloon called the Prairie Rose, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a small post office, and a scattering of homes along the side streets, some of them frame houses with real glass windows, some of them little more than board shacks with tar paper roofs. The railroad had come through 2 years earlier, and the town was in the particular phase of boom that always preceded either prosperity or collapse, a coin still spinning. Gideon tied his horse at the livery, paid the liveryman 2 bits for a night's keep, and walked down the main street toward the saloon, because that was where information lived in a town like this. He needed to find Hector Burns and he needed a meal, and he carried himself with his hat pulled low and his shoulders square, because he had learned in the past months that the way you entered a room was the first and most important negotiation you would conduct in it. The Prairie Rose was dim and smelled of sawdust and tobacco, and the particular flatness of beer that has sat too long in the barrel. There were perhaps 8 men inside, 2 playing cards at a back table, 3 at the bar, and another 3 seated separately along the wall. The bartender was a stout man with a red face and an expression of permanent mild suspicion. Gideon ordered a beer he could barely afford and asked about Hector Burns. "Burns is out on his spread most days," the bartender told him. "You'd want to ride out in the morning. His place is 6 miles north. Follow the creek bed, you'll see the gate." "Appreciate it," Gideon said. He nursed the beer and ate the plate of beans and salt pork the bartender produced for 15 cents and listened to the room around him, which was the habit he had developed in these months of traveling, the habit of listening before speaking, of taking in a place before declaring himself in it. It was while he was doing this, sitting at the end of the bar, that the door opened and the woman came in. She was not the kind of woman who made a dramatic entrance. She was not particularly loud or particularly arresting in the way that draws every eye at once. But there was something about the way she carried herself, purposeful, unhurried, accustomed to navigating spaces that were not designed for her, that made Gideon look up from his plate. She was perhaps 27 or 28, with brown hair pinned up under a practical hat, a dark dress that had been mended at the left sleeve, and eyes the color of creek water over clay, not quite green, not quite brown, alive with something that was neither warmth nor coldness but a kind of clear, steady assessment. She was carrying a covered dish. She went straight to the bartender without any self-consciousness about being a woman in a saloon, set the dish on the bar and said, "Evening, Tom. I brought that stew I promised. Jeb Calhoun around?" "He's in the back, Tom," the bartender said, and his voice had changed, softer, respectful in a way it had not been for Gideon. "Thank you," the woman said, and lifted the dish and carried it toward the back without another word. She passed close enough to Gideon that he could have reached out and touched the edge of her sleeve. She smelled of wood smoke and something faintly herbal like dried lavender. She did not look at him. He looked at her, just for a moment, and then looked back at his plate because looking at someone too long in a saloon was its own kind of statement. Tom the bartender caught his look and said with the mild proprietary pride of a man who considers himself the town's official chronicler, "That's Nora Lawson, widow. Her husband died 2 years back. She's got a small place south of town. Does washing and mending, brings meals sometimes to old Calhoun who's laid up with his leg. Good woman." "Clearly," Gideon said. He finished his meal and paid his bill and went to sleep in the hayloft of the livery stable, because he could not afford the rooming house, and in the morning he rode out to find Hector Burns. Burns hired him on a handshake at the end of a 15-minute conversation, because Burns was a practical man who needed someone who could read cattle and knew the land and could be trusted not to steal, and Gideon was all three. The pay was $12 a month plus meals and a bunk in the ranch house, which was not grand but was more than Gideon had had in 6 months. He started that same afternoon. The work was hard and steady, and gave him the thing he needed most, which was not money but occupation, the specific mercy of exhaustion, of a body so used up by evening that the mind did not have room for the particular litany of regret and loss that had been his constant companion since December. He fed cattle and repaired fence and helped with the branding and rode the north pasture looking for strays, and he did all of it well because it was what he knew, and because the doing of it reminded him that he was still, underneath everything, a man who was good at something. He saw Nora Lawson again on his second Sunday in Harvest Creek. He had ridden into town for the Sunday service, partly because it seemed the right thing to do and partly because he needed thread, and the dry goods store kept Sunday hours after church. The service was held in the building that was both church and schoolhouse, a white-painted frame structure with a proper bell that Mr. Elias Whitmore had donated in 1877, and the congregation was the entirety of the town's respectable population, plus a few hands from the surrounding ranches. Nora Lawson sat 3 rows ahead of him, alone, with a boy of perhaps 6 or 7 beside her. Gideon had not known about the boy. He looked at the back of her head, at the careful way her hair was pinned, at the particular straightness of her spine that suggested not stiffness but a long-practiced self-sufficiency. And he thought about Tom the bartender's 3 words: good woman, widow. The boy beside her was dark-haired and serious-faced, and sat very still through the service in the way that children sit still when they have been raised by someone who is alone and who needs their cooperation. At one point he leaned very slightly against his mother's arm, and she shifted without looking at him, making a space for him. And the gesture was so small and so automatic and so full of love that Gideon felt something in his chest respond to it without his permission. After the service in the yard, people gathered the way they did in small towns, renewing the week's social contract. Gideon stood near the fence, hat in hand, accepting introductions as they came. He met the schoolteacher, a thin and energetic young man named Bernard Cole. He met Elias Whitmore, who owned the dry goods store and was the closest thing Harvest Creek had to a leading citizen. He met the preacher, Reverend Abrams, who had a handshake like a blacksmith, and then Bernard Cole was steering him by the elbow toward the group near the church door, saying, "You ought to meet Nora Lawson. She knows everyone and everything in this town." And then there she was up close with those clear creekwater eyes looking at him with the same frank assessment she had directed at Tom's bar. "Nora, this is Gideon Ford," Bernard said. "He's working out at Hector Burns's place." "I know," she said. "Tom mentioned you." She put out her hand, which was slightly rough at the palm from work, and shook his with a firm, brief pressure. "Are you planning to stay?" It was an interesting first question. Most people asked where he came from. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. Something in her face responded to the honesty, a small shift, a fraction of increased attention. "Fair enough," she said. "This is my son, Eli." She laid her hand briefly on the dark-haired boy's shoulder. "He's 7. "Ma'am," Eli said very seriously. "Good afternoon," Gideon said to the boy, matching his seriousness. "Are you learning to ride?" "Yes, sir." "My mother's horse won't go fast, though." "Eli," Nora said, with the particular tone that is not quite reproach but close to it. "He won't," Eli said unapologetically. "That's a reasonable complaint," Gideon said, and Nora Lawson laughed, a short, surprised sound, as if she had not quite expected to. He walked away from that conversation with the thread he'd come for, and the knowledge that he would see Nora Lawson again, not from any particular design but because Harvest Creek was a small town and she was in it, and he had the feeling, the instinctive and unignorable feeling, that she was worth knowing. The weeks that followed were orderly and purposeful. He worked hard at Burns's ranch and began to save a small portion of his wages with the vague, and not yet fully articulated intention of doing something with it. He did not know exactly what. The idea of owning land again was too large to look at directly, the way you cannot look directly at the sun, but it was there, present, pulling him. He saw Nora regularly in the way that people see each other in small towns, at the Sunday service, in the dry goods store on the street. They developed the habit of brief, genuine conversation. She was not a woman who engaged in small talk for its own sake. Every exchange she had seemed to have some substance in it, some actual content or observation or question. She would ask him something real, what he thought of the weather pattern that spring, whether he believed the railroad extension would come through Harvest Creek as promised, whether he found it difficult to work for someone else when he had once managed his own land. That last question she asked on a Tuesday afternoon in May, when they happened both to be at the well at the edge of town, she filling a bucket and he watering his horse before the ride back to the ranch. "Does it bother you?" she said. "Working for Burns when you had your own place?" He looked at her for a moment. "You know about my history. Tom knows every story in 100 miles, she said, without apology. "Did it bother you?" "Some days," he said. He was quiet for a moment, not because he was avoiding the truth, but because he was locating it with precision. "The first week, yes. Every fence post I fixed, I was thinking about the fence posts I used to fix on my own land. Every order Burns gave me, I was thinking about the orders I used to give. But after a while I stopped comparing and just did the work, and then it wasn't so bad. The work itself doesn't know who owns it." She was watching him with that clear, assessing look. "That's a very mature way to think about it." "It's a survival way to think about it," he said. "I'm not sure it's the same thing." She picked up her bucket. "Maybe not," she said. "But you're still here, which is something." She walked back toward her house, and he watched her go, the bucket in one hand, her stride steady and unhurried, and he thought again that she was the most plainly honest person he had met in a long time. He learned more about her, gradually, in the way that knowledge accumulates in a small town, not through interrogation but through the slow accretion of detail. Her husband, a man named Robert Lawson, had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1877, leaving her with the small property south of town, a house, a garden, a milk cow, and a horse that did not go fast, and Eli, who had been 5 years old. She had no family of her own in Harvest Creek. She had followed Robert here from Missouri when they married in 1869. Her people were back in Missouri, older now, and she did not have the means to travel. She had, by all accounts, neither collapsed nor complained. She had picked up the washing and mending work within a month of Robert's death, had kept the garden productive, had sold the milk from her cow, and had raised Eli with a steady, loving firmness that the whole town admired. She accepted help when it was offered in the form of practical assistance, a neighbor who split her winter wood, Tom, who occasionally passed her meals from the saloon kitchen for the old men in town who had no one to cook for them. But she did not ask for help, and she did not accept charity. Gideon Ford, who had his own complicated relationship with pride and assistance, found this deeply familiar. In June, a small crisis presented itself in the form of Nora's roof. 3 days of rain, unusual and welcome rain for the Panhandle, revealed that the roof over her back room had developed a rot in the framing that was allowing water inside. She had mentioned it, matter-of-factly, to the preacher's wife on Sunday, not as a complaint but as information, the way you might note that a fence needed fixing. Gideon heard about it from Elias Whitmore on Monday when he came into town for nails. On Wednesday, which was his half-day off from Burns's ranch, he rode to her place with tools and roofing material he had bought with a portion of his savings. She was in the garden when he rode up, on her knees in the dirt pulling something, and she stood when she heard the horse. She looked at the tools. She looked at him. She did not look grateful in the soft, melting way that some people look grateful when they are also relieved to be rescued. She looked first slightly annoyed and then thoughtful, and then she said with great care, "I was planning to ask Bernard Cole to help me with that on Saturday." "Bernard Cole is a fine schoolteacher," Gideon said. "Does he know anything about roofs?" A pause. "No," she admitted. "I do," he said simply. "I built most of my own outbuildings. I know roofs. It won't take long if we start now, and you won't have to wait for Saturday." She looked at him for another moment, and he understood that she was weighing something, not his competence, but the gesture itself, what it meant, what it would cost her to accept it. "I'll pay you," she said. "You won't," he said pleasantly. "I had a free afternoon and a neighbor with a leaking roof. That's a straightforward situation." Another pause. "All right," she said finally. "The back room is through there. I'll show you." He spent 3 hours on her roof, and she spent those same 3 hours in the garden and then the kitchen, and at the end of it she brought him water and cornbread, which he ate on her porch steps. Eli came out and sat beside him and talked at considerable length about a horned toad he had found near the water trough, and Gideon listened with genuine interest and offered the opinion that horned toads were among the more underrated creatures of the Texas Panhandle, which Eli received with the intense satisfaction of a child whose enthusiasms have been endorsed by an adult. Nora stood in the doorway listening to this exchange, and her face held something that Gideon could not quite name, not quite happiness, not quite sadness, something in between, the look of a woman who has arranged her life very carefully and is not quite sure what to do when something outside that arrangement turns out to be good. "Thank you," she said, when he picked up his tools to leave. "Thank you for the cornbread," he said. "It was better than anything I've eaten at Burns's table, and I say that with no disloyalty intended." She laughed again, that short, surprised sound, and he thought that he would like very much to be the cause of that sound on a regular basis. The summer in the Texas Panhandle in 1879 was hot the way Texas summers always were, massive and unrelenting, the sky a white-hot dome from June through August, the air thick and still in the afternoons and only marginally better at night. The work at Burns's ranch intensified with the season. There were cattle drives to coordinate, water sources to manage, constant vigilance against the kind of fire that could take a grass range in an hour when the wind was from the southwest. Gideon worked through it steadily. He had, in the months since arriving in Harvest Creek, established himself as a man of competence and reliability, the sort of man other men around a ranch quickly come to depend on. Burns had given him more responsibility and an additional $2 a month, and the savings Gideon was accumulating in a tin box in the bunkhouse were beginning to feel like something more than emergency funds. He and Nora did not see each other as often in July, when the work was relentless and the heat made town a place to avoid unless necessary. But when they did see each other, at the Sunday service, at the well, twice by apparent chance on the road between the ranch and town when he was riding in for supplies, and she was returning from the same, they talked with increasing ease, the way that two people begin to talk when they have established that they are safe with each other. It was on one of these road encounters in late July that Nora told him about her parents. They had stopped their horses in the shade of a cottonwood along the creek bank, taking the excuse of the shade on a blazing afternoon, and she told him that she had received a letter from her mother in Missouri saying that her father was ill, that it was serious, and that she did not know whether she would be able to see him before he passed. "Can you go?" he asked. "The train would be $8 one way," she said. It was not a complaint, just a fact. "And I can't take Eli out of school, and I can't leave him alone, and I don't have anyone to stay with him for that long. What about Elias Whitmore's wife? She has her own children and her hands are full," Nora said. "It's all right. My mother understands." But it was not all right, and he could see it in the careful way she held her expression neutral, the slight tightness around her eyes. He said nothing else about it because he understood that she was not looking for a solution, only for someone to hear her, and so he listened, and after a while she straightened in the saddle and said she needed to get back for Eli's supper, and they rode their separate ways. He thought about it for 2 days. Then he spoke to Mrs. Emily Abrams, the preacher's wife, who was known to be the town's most capable person in all practical matters, and arranged with her to take Eli for 2 weeks at the preacher's house, where there were already 3 children close to Eli's age. Then he bought a train ticket to St. Louis with $12 from his savings. Because St. Louis was the connection point for the Missouri line, wrapped it in a piece of brown paper, and left it with a note at the dry goods store where Nora came every Friday. The note said only, "Mrs. Abrams has agreed to take Eli. The ticket can be exchanged for any date within the month. I will look after your horse and cow while you are gone. G.F." He did not see her until Sunday. She walked up to him in the churchyard after service and stood in front of him, and he could see that she had been thinking hard about what to say and had not quite settled it. "That was too much," she said. "The ticket money is too much." "It was $12, he said. "I can spare it. I don't know when I can pay it back." "It's not a loan," he said. "Your father is ill. You should be able to go." She looked at him with that clear, assessing gaze, and he had the feeling that she was looking for something, some indication of motive, some angle or expectation that would explain the gesture in terms she could evaluate and respond to. He held her look steadily. "Why," she said finally, "because you would have done it for someone else," he said, "and it didn't seem right that no one would do it for you." She was quiet for a long moment. Eli was chasing one of the Abrams children around the church steps with the indefatigable energy of a 7-year-old. The morning sun came across the yard at a low angle and caught the edges of her hair. "All right," she said at last. "Thank you, Gideon." It was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed it. She went to Missouri for 12 days. He cared for her horse and her cow morning and evening and made sure the garden had water. Eli stayed at the Abrams' house and reported, when Gideon ran into him in town, that Mrs. Abrams was a very good cook, but not as good as his mother, which Gideon relayed in his next brief note to Mrs. Abrams, with the hope that she would not take it personally. Nora returned on a Thursday in August, and her father was still alive, and she had seen him, and she came back looking both relieved and quietly devastated in the way of someone who has seen something difficult and has not yet fully absorbed it. She came to find Gideon at the ranch the next afternoon, which surprised him because she had never come to the ranch before, and she handed him an envelope with $12 in it. "I worked for my mother's neighbor while I was there," she said. "She needed help with her preserves and paid me well. Please take it." He looked at the envelope. He looked at her. He could see that she needed him to take it not for the money's sake but for her own, because the accepting of a gift that large without recourse was something she was not built to sustain. "All right," he said, and took it. "How is your father?" "Holding on," she said. "He may recover. The doctor says there's a chance." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet with a wetness she would not release. "I'm glad you went," he said. "So am I," she said, "more than I can say." She looked at him then with a directness that was different from her usual assessment, something more unguarded, more open, as if the trip had done something to her careful self-containment, and she had not yet entirely reassembled it. He felt the look go through him in a way that was entirely distinct from anything he had felt in a long time. "I should get back," she said, and turned her horse. He watched her ride away, and then stood in the yard with the envelope in his hand for a while before he went back to work. In September, Eli started his second year of school, and the fall settled over the Panhandle with a gentleness that was the region's apology for its brutal summer. The grass went gold and then brown, and the sunsets became the particular spectacular pink, an orange that the flat country produces, with nothing to interrupt the horizon, and Harvest Creek had its first successful harvest festival in 3 years, which the town celebrated with a barbecue and a fiddle dance in the street outside the Prairie Rose. Gideon went, because Burns gave his hands the Saturday off and the whole town would be there. He wore a clean shirt and his better hat, and arrived to find the street transformed, lanterns hung from the storefronts, tables set with food contributed from every household, the fiddle player already at work on a reel that was pulling couples into the space between the tables. He found Nora standing near the food table talking with Bernard Cole, the schoolteacher, and Elias Whitmore's daughter, who was 17 and very amused with everything. Nora was wearing a dress he had not seen before, dark blue, with a simple white collar, and her hair was down further than usual, pinned but loose, and she looked in the lantern light different from her daytime self, softer at the edges, easier. "You came," she said when he reached the group. "So did everyone," he said. "Where's Eli?" "With the Abrams children tormenting the cat," she said. "He'll appear when there's food." He stayed near her through the early evening, moving through conversations with the natural gravity that the two of them had developed over months of proximity, and at some point the fiddle shifted to a slower tune and Bernard Cole asked Elias Whitmore's daughter to dance, and they went, and Gideon and Nora were standing alone beside the table with their tin cups of cider. "Dance," he said. She looked at the dancing couples and then at him. "I haven't danced since before Robert died," she said. "I'm probably rusty." "So am I," he said. They went into the dancing space, and she put her hand in his and his hand went to her waist, and for a moment they were both very formally correct about the distance between them, and then the music caught them both, and they forgot to be formal. She was not rusty. She moved well, with the ease of someone for whom rhythm comes naturally, and he was better than he expected, because the body remembers certain things regardless of how long it has been. They danced through the slow tune and then through the next one, which was faster, and when they finally stopped they were both laughing, genuinely and without design, and they were standing closer together than they had ever stood. He looked down at her and she looked up at him, and the lantern light was orange and warm between them, and he could see quite clearly that she felt whatever this was, this particular gravitational field that had been building since May, just as acutely as he did. "Nora," he said. "Don't say anything ridiculous," she said, but she was smiling when she said it. "I was going to say thank you for the dance." "Oh," she said. "Well, you're welcome." She stepped back just slightly. "Would you like some more cider?" "Very much," he said. They drank cider and talked until Eli materialized out of the crowd exactly as predicted. At the moment the food appeared, and attached himself to Gideon's side with the proprietorial ease of a child who has decided that someone is trustworthy and is acting accordingly. Gideon ate his plate of food with the boy beside him and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific warmth of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He walked Nora and Eli home that night because it was late and the road was dark, and at her door he held his hat in his hands and said good night, and she said good night, and Eli said good night with a gravity that suggested he considered himself a full participant in the evening's social contract. "Gideon," Nora said as he turned. He turned back. "You're a good man," she said. It came out simply, without performance, the way she said everything direct and meant. He could not think of anything to say that was equal to that, so he only nodded and walked away. And behind him he heard her door close, and the October night was cold and clear and full of stars, and he walked the 2 miles back to Burns's ranch with the kind of lightness in his step that a man carries when something he had stopped expecting has quietly, inexorably begun. October became November, and the thing between them continued to build in the careful, incremental way of two people who have both been hurt by life in different ways and have learned to be deliberate. They did not rush anything. They did not perform anything. They talked, at the Sunday service and at the well and on the road and twice at her kitchen table over coffee, and the talking was the kind that builds actual knowledge of another person, their past, their fears, their particular small joys and large worries. He told her, one evening at her kitchen table while Eli slept in the back room, about the loss of the land. He had told parts of it before to various people in the abbreviated way that became habit, the drought, the fever, the debt. But now he told all of it, including the part he never told, which was the way he had stood in the empty house on the last morning and said, out loud to no one, "What did I do wrong?" And could not answer the question, and the not answering had been the worst part, because it meant it was not something he could fix. Nora listened to all of it without interruption, without reassurance, without the various forms of consolation that people offer because silence makes them uncomfortable. She just listened, and at the end she said, "I asked the same question when Robert died. What did I do wrong that this happened?" And the answer was nothing, which is the worst answer because it means you couldn't have prevented it. "Yes," he said, "exactly that. You learn to stop asking," she said. "Eventually, you ask different questions instead, like what do I do now?" "What did you do?" he asked. "That first month." "I got up every morning," she said. "That was the whole strategy. Get up, do the next thing, don't look too far ahead because too far ahead is terrifying, just the next thing." She paused. "It sounds simple, but it wasn't." "No," he said. "I know." They sat in the quiet of her kitchen for a while, the wood stove ticking as it cooled, and the silence was entirely comfortable, which was its own kind of revelation. He began to court her in November, openly and deliberately, because he was not a man who could sustain ambiguity. He brought her things, nothing grand. He did not have the means for grand but small and considered things. A sack of good coffee from the supply wagon that came through town. A book he had found at the dry goods store that she had mentioned once in passing as a title she had never managed to read, Wildflower Seeds, that he had traded for with a rancher's wife who was known for her garden, and who had known exactly what he was about when he asked. He asked her permission first. He came to her door on a Sunday afternoon in early November and said plainly, "Nora, I would like to court you if that's agreeable to you. I don't want to proceed on assumptions." She stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression he could not quite read, and then she said, It's agreeable, and let him in for coffee, and that was that. Eli received the news of Gideon's increased presence around the house with the philosophical calm of a 7-year-old who has already privately decided something, and is gratified to have it officially confirmed. He showed Gideon his collection of arrowheads, which he kept in a tin box under his bed, and asked whether Gideon thought they were Apache or Comanche, which led to a very long and genuine conversation about the history of the Texas Panhandle, including the fact that the Comanche had been the dominant power on this land for more than a century before the army campaigns of the early 1870s had pushed them from it. Something Gideon described with a plainness that included the injustice of it. Because he was not the kind of man to dress up history in comfortable clothes. So this land used to be theirs, Eli said, looking at the arrowheads with a new expression. For a long time, yes, Gideon said. That doesn't seem right, Eli said. No, Gideon said. It doesn't. Nora, from the doorway, had listened to this exchange, and when Gideon looked up, she gave him a small nod that communicated something like approval, and he felt it more keenly than almost anything else she had ever said to him. December came, with its cold winds off the caprock and its early darks and its particular quality of silence over the flat land, and Gideon Ford was a changed man from the one who had ridden into Harvest Creek in April with his borrowed horse and his careful dignity. He was not restored, not yet, not entirely, but he was oriented. He had direction. He had a job he was good at, savings that were becoming meaningful, a town where he was known and respected, and Nora Lawson, whose presence in his life had, without fanfare or announcement, become the organizing fact of it. He had also been thinking with increasing seriousness about the land. There was a parcel 6 miles east of Harvest Creek, 160 acres that had been homesteaded under the Homestead Act, and then abandoned when the first homesteader's wife refused to stay, and which the county was now making available for purchase at a price that was, for the quality of the land, extremely fair. He had seen it on a ride in October and recognized immediately that the grass was good, the creek access was reliable, and the slope and drainage were right for cattle. He had ridden back twice more to look at it, measuring it in his mind against what he knew of cattle land, which was considerable. He could not afford to buy it outright. He could afford a down payment and the first season's operating costs if he used everything he had saved and borrowed carefully. Hector Burns, he suspected, would loan him a small amount against his wages, because Burns was a fair man who understood that good hands sometimes needed help to get to the next level. He told Nora about it in December, on one of the evenings when Eli was asleep and they sat by her wood stove with coffee. He explained the plan with the careful precision of a man who has thought something through thoroughly and wants to present it honestly rather than romantically. It would take 2 or 3 years to get it properly established, he said. Start small, maybe 50 head, build up. It would be hard at first. She listened to all of it and then she said, "Do you want to do it?" "Yes," he said. "Very much." "Then you should," she said simply. "It's a risk." "Everything is a risk," she said. "You know what you're doing with land and cattle. That's a better foundation than most people start with." He looked at her across the small table, the wood stove between them, and said, "Nora, there's a part of this I haven't said yet." She waited. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the land and not because of Eli, though those are both things that matter to me. I'm asking because I am very much in love with you and I want to build this life with you beside me. But I need you to know that at this moment I have some savings, a ranch hand's wage, and a plan for land I don't own yet. I'm not offering you comfort right now. I'm offering you a direction." The wood stove ticked. The wind pushed at the window. Nora Lawson sat across the table from him with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and her clear eyes looking at him with an expression that had come down from its usual careful heights and was simply, openly feeling. "When Robert died," she said after a moment, "the first thing people asked me was whether he had left money, whether I would be all right financially. That was the first concern, not whether I was all right, but whether I had resources." And what I found in the years since is that the people who showed up for me never showed up with resources. They showed up with time or work or just themselves. She paused. You showed up with a roof repair and a train ticket and honesty, she said, and you never once asked me for anything in return. I didn't help you to get something, he said. I know, she said. That's the point. She set down the coffee cup and looked at him steadily. Yes, Gideon, I'll marry you. He let out a breath that he had been holding for an undetermined amount of time and reached across the table and took her hand. And she let him. And they sat like that for a while, holding on, in the warm and quiet kitchen while the December wind ran along the outside of the house and found no way in. They were married in February of 1880, in the white church with the donated bell, by Reverend Abrams, in front of what seemed to be the entire population of Harvest Creek, plus several people from the surrounding ranches who had come because they liked Gideon or because they loved Nora or both. Elias Whitmore stood up with Gideon. Bernard Cole played the piano. Eli, resplendent in a new collar that Nora had stayed up until midnight sewing, walked his mother down the aisle with a seriousness that made several grown adults cry without embarrassment. Nora wore a dress of deep ivory wool that she had made herself over 3 weeks of winter evenings, and she was the most beautiful thing Gideon Ford had ever seen, not because the dress was fine or the setting was grand, but because of the way she looked at him when Reverend Abrams said her cue and she said, clearly and without hesitation, I do. As if it were the simplest and most obvious thing she had ever said. He said it back with the same plainness and the same certainty, and meant every syllable. The reception was held in the street outside the Prairie Rose, again with the tables and lanterns and fiddle player, who seemed to exist in Harvest Creek specifically for occasions like this. And the whole town ate Burns's donated beef and drank the cider that Elias Whitmore had provided and watched Gideon and Nora dance, and this time there was no careful distance between them. They moved as people move who are no longer negotiating but have settled into a shared language, who have found the rhythm between them and decided to keep it. Tom the bartender, who had been the one to tell Gideon about the widow on his first night in town, stood at the edge of the dancing crowd with his arms crossed and his red face arranged in an expression of profound satisfaction, and told everyone within earshot, unprompted, that he had known from the first night how it would end. They moved into Nora's house while the plans for the new property developed, because her house was established and Eli's schooling was already set, and there was no reason to disrupt the practicalities of their life while the larger project came together. Gideon sold his horse and bought a better one suitable for ranch work, arranged the financing for the eastern parcel, and spent the early months of 1880 both working Burns's ranch and preparing the new land on his days off, clearing brush from the creek access, and repairing the section of fence that the previous homesteader had left standing. Burns, true to Gideon's estimate of him, had provided the loan without much ceremony, $300, repayable over 4 years, with a handshake and a piece of paper, and the observation that Gideon was the best hand he had employed in a decade, and he was sorry to lose him, but a man with that much capability ought to be working his own land. Living with Nora was nothing like Gideon had expected, which was to say it was much better. He had imagined, vaguely, a kind of negotiated coexistence, 2 established, independent people learning to share space and routine. What he found was something easier and stranger and more joyful than that. She was good company. She was funny, in a dry and understated way that appeared without warning and was all the more effective for it. She had opinions about everything and was unafraid to express them and equally unafraid to change them when given a good argument, which was, in Gideon's experience, a rarer quality than most people credited. He had not thought much in his bachelor years about the specific pleasures of domestic life, the warmth of a table set for more than one, the sound of another person moving through the house in the morning, the way that a meal cooked for and eaten with someone you loved was a fundamentally different experience from the same meal eaten alone. He thought about these things now, with something close to wonder. Eli adopted him with a thoroughness and a lack of self-consciousness that was deeply humbling. He called Gideon by his given name. Nora had told him he could call Gideon whatever felt right, and Eli had decided that Gideon was right, which had a dignified quality to it that they both respected. And he followed Gideon around on weekends with the reliable intensity of a 7-year-old who has found someone interesting. He learned to saddle the horse and to read a cattle brand and to identify good grass from poor. He was a quick and observant child, serious-minded and occasionally very funny in the way that children are funny when they are not trying to be. And Gideon loved him with a straightforward completeness that arrived without ceremony and without condition. The Ford property, they called it that from the beginning, though Nora's name was on the deed, beside Gideon's began to take shape through the spring of 1880. The first herd was small, 42 head of mixed longhorn and shorthorn stock that Gideon had bought at careful prices from 2 different sources, selecting each animal himself. He built the main fence, with Eli handing him tools on Saturdays and asking questions at a rate that would have exhausted a lesser person, and hired a hand named Vicente Santos, a Mexican-American man who had grown up working cattle in South Texas and who knew the land the way Gideon knew the land. And between the two of them, they put the property in order through the long summer of 1880. Nora continued her washing and mending through the spring, not because they needed the income, but because she had the clients and the relationships, and she did not intend to simply drop them. By summer she had begun to taper it off, as the ranch's first revenues started to come in and as the garden at the Ford place, which was larger than the one at the old house, demanded more of her time. She planted aggressively and intelligently, the way she did everything, and by August the kitchen garden was producing more than they could use, which led to the side business of selling preserved goods to the dry goods store, which Elias Whitmore was delighted to carry because Nora's preserves were extraordinary. This was not something either of them had planned. It was simply Nora's industry expressing itself in the direction available to it. In the evenings, they sat on the porch of the ranch house, a porch that Gideon had built in June, which Nora had specified should face west to catch the sunsets, which were indeed spectacular, and talked, or sat in companionable quiet, or read when they had the light. Eli came and went between the porch and whatever project currently absorbed him inside. Vicente Santos, who had a bunk in the small building Gideon had built alongside the main barn, sometimes joined them on the porch steps after supper, and the conversation ranged easily from cattle prices to local politics to the question of whether the railroad extension would actually materialize, and on at least one occasion to the history of the land they were sitting on and what had stood here before any of them. Vicente, whose grandmother had been born in the territory, had a way of talking about the history of the land that was different from anything Gideon had encountered before, direct and particular, without the romance or the dismissal that the question usually received. He talked about the Comanche trails that had crossed this land for generations, about the way the water had been known and mapped long before any Anglo settler appeared. Nora listened to these conversations with the same careful attention she brought to everything, and asked Vicente direct questions, and the respect between them was genuine and mutual. In November of 1880, Nora told Gideon, quietly and with a smile she could not contain, that she was expecting a child. He sat down in the kitchen chair with an abruptness that startled them both, and then stood up again and held her face in his hands and said something completely incoherent that she laughed at, and then he held her for a long time without saying anything at all. Eli, when informed, received the news with a brief but intense period of thought, followed by the announcement that he would like the baby to be a boy, because he had thought of names already. The baby arrived in July of 1881, a boy, red-faced and emphatic, whom they named James Robert Ford James for no particular reason except that it felt right, and Robert for Nora's first husband, because it seemed to them both right and important that Eli's father be remembered in the naming, and because Nora said that Robert had been a good man and it would honor him, and Gideon agreed without hesitation. Eli took one look at James in Nora's arms and said, with great satisfaction, "He looks like a James." This was the totality of his commentary for the first 24 hours, after which he became deeply involved in explaining the various features of the ranch to the infant, who was, admittedly, not yet in a position to appreciate them. The ranch grew through 1881 and into 1882. The herd doubled, and then doubled again. Gideon hired a second hand, a young man from Kansas named Samuel Pryor who was 19 and strong and willing and learned quickly. The fence line expanded, taking in an additional 40 acres that Gideon purchased from a neighbor who was moving east. The loan to Burns was repaid a year ahead of schedule, at which point Burns came out to the Ford ranch himself, shook hands with Gideon for a long time, ate supper with the family, and went home looking satisfied in the way of a man who has bet on the right horse. There were difficult seasons, too. A late frost in 1882 that cost them 12 calves, a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Wallace Pitcher over the placement of a fence line that required a surveyor, and 6 weeks of unpleasant exchanges before it was resolved in their favor. A summer in 1883 when the creek ran low, and they had to hand water part of the herd, and it cost them a month of intensive labor and a portion of that year's margin. But none of it broke them. Gideon had been broken before and knew what it felt like, and this was not it. This was the ordinary difficulty of building something, the kind of difficulty that, when you have the right foundation, you can withstand. And the foundation was right. He knew it every morning when he woke up beside Nora, every evening when the four of them sat at the kitchen table, and the conversation went 6 ways at once. The foundation was right because the people were right, and that was not something he had understood when he was 25 and building his first ranch, when he had thought that the quality of the land and the size of the herd were the most important things. By the spring of 1883, the Ford ranch was profitable. Not extravagantly so, not by the measure of the great ranch operations that were beginning to consolidate the Panhandle's land, but solidly, sustainably so. They had 130 head of cattle, 2 reliable hands, a kitchen garden that was supplying the dry goods store and 2 restaurants in the next town over, a horse strong and fast enough that Eli, who was 11 now and a serious horseman, could finally have no complaint. Gideon stood at the fence of the main pasture one evening in April of 1883 and looked out over the land, the gold-green grass in the late light, the cattle moving slowly across the middle distance, the creek lined dark with cottonwoods on the far edge, the sky enormous and orange and fading into violet, and he felt something that was not triumph, because triumph implies something was conquered, and this land had never needed to be conquered. It needed to be worked and understood and respected, and he had done his best to do all 3. He heard steps on the grass behind him, and then Nora was beside him at the fence, her arm against his, looking out at the same view. "Thinking about something," she said. "I'm thinking about all of it," he said. "Where it started." "The borrowed horse," she said. He looked at her surprised and pleased. "You knew about the horse. Tom told me," she said. "First week you were here, he said you came in on a borrowed horse and conducted yourself as if you owned the town." He laughed. "That's a generous way to put it." "I thought so too," she said. "I thought you must either be very brave or very foolish, and I hadn't decided which. And now." She leaned her shoulder against his. "Jury is still out," she said, but she was smiling, and he could feel the smile even without looking at her directly. He put his arm around her and they stood at the fence in the evening light, and James's voice came from somewhere behind the house, shouting something at Eli with the imperious conviction of a nearly 2-year-old, and Eli's voice came back, patient and exasperated in equal measure. "I remember," Gideon said, "when you asked me if I was planning to stay." First Sunday, she said. Yes. I didn't know then, he said. But I think I was already staying. I just hadn't admitted it yet. I know, she said. I could tell. He looked at her. You could tell. You looked at the town like you were measuring it, she said. Most people who aren't staying look at a town like they're passing through. You looked at it like you were deciding. You noticed that. I notice most things, she said simply. Then, after a pause, I noticed you. He turned toward her and she turned toward him, and the evening light was exactly right. And he kissed her in the field with the cattle 20 yards away and the children's voices carrying from behind the house. And it was not a dramatic kiss, not the kind that belongs to stories about grand passion, but the kind that belongs to a long and particular love, the kind that knows its ground. Nora, he said, against her hair. What? When I lost everything, he said, you asked nothing of me. You just let me be what I was, a man with nothing and a borrowed horse. She was quiet for a moment. You didn't need me to ask anything, she said. You needed someone to just be there while you figured it out. Yes, he said. And I have thought about that, he said, every single day since I had something worth thinking about again. Since the land and James and Eli and all of it. I have thought about the fact that you never asked for anything. That's what you do for people, she said. You don't make conditions on their worth. He held her closer and she let him, one hand against the fence post and the other against his arm, and the April evening spread out around them, vast and golden and entirely theirs. The summer of 1883 brought two significant events. The first was a letter from Nora's mother in Missouri, reporting that her father had made an unexpected and substantial recovery from his illness and was, at 71, in better health than he had been in 5 years. The letter produced in Nora an emotion so large and sudden that she had to sit down at the kitchen table and breathe through it while Gideon read it over her shoulder and said, quietly, "Good. That's very good. I should go see him," she said. "Properly this time I should take the children." "We'll all go," Gideon said. She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to meet your parents." They went in September, when the ranch could be left safely in Vicent's capable hands. All 4 of them on the train, Nora with James on her lap and Eli beside the window, counting every cow he saw from the rail, and Gideon opposite them with his hat on his knee, watching his family with the private and overwhelming feeling of a man who knows exactly how lucky he is. Nora's parents were a small, sharp-eyed couple named William and Me Dunbar, who lived in a proper frame house outside of Joplin, Missouri. William Dunbar was thinner than he had once been but alert and warm-spoken, and he shook Gideon's hand for a long time in the way of a father who has been relieved about his daughter and wants the man responsible to know it. Me Dunbar took one look at Gideon and then at Nora and then at James, who was toddling at speed in several directions at once, and said, "Well, this is better than I hoped, and I hoped quite a lot." They stayed a week. William Dunbar and Gideon spent 3 of the 7 evenings on the porch talking about land, about cattle, about the Texas Panhandle, about the war that both of them had served in, and neither of them talked about much. About loss and recovery and what a man does with the years he has after the worst ones. On the last evening, William said, "She's happy. I can see it in the way she talks to you, not just content happy." "I hope so," Gideon said. "I know so," William said. "A father can tell." He paused. "She was alone for 2 years and she never complained. Never once wrote me a letter that wasn't cheerful. I knew it was harder than she let on, but that's Nora. She carries things without advertising them." He looked at Gideon directly. "I'm glad she found someone who sees her." "She's not hard to see," Gideon said. "You just have to actually look." William Dunbar made a sound of approval and poured them both more of the very good whiskey that he kept for occasions, and they sat on the porch in the Missouri evening and listened to me and Nora's voices from the kitchen, laughing at something, and Eli's voice mixed in with theirs, and the light from the windows fell yellow and warm across the porch boards. They returned to Harvest Creek in late September, and the ranch was exactly as they had left it, Vicent having managed admirably, as Gideon had expected he would. James came home with a vocabulary that had expanded significantly during the trip, primarily due to Eli, who had decided that expanding James's vocabulary was an important project. Some of the new words required a quiet conversation. The second child came in the winter of 1884, a girl this time, whom they named Clara Me Ford, me for Nora's mother, whom Nora had promised a name. Clara arrived in December with considerably less drama than James had, as if she had decided to be efficient about it. And from her first week, she had Nora's clear, evaluating gaze and a disposition of complete self-possession. James, at 2.5, regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity that was entirely appropriate to his age and temperament. Eli, at 12, regarded her with a protective gravity that suggested he had already decided he would be responsible for her in ways that no one had asked him to be. "You don't have to watch her quite that carefully," Nora told him, one evening when Eli was sitting beside Clara's cradle in the manner of a sentinel. "Someone should," Eli said, entirely seriously. Gideon, hearing this from the doorway, looked at Nora, and Nora looked at him, and they both very carefully did not laugh until they were in the kitchen. The years moved as good years do, not slowly, not quickly, but with a fullness that fills the time without wasting it. The ranch continued to grow and to consolidate. In 1885, Gideon purchased an additional 80 acres to the north, bringing the Ford land to just over 300 acres, which was almost exactly the acreage he had held in San Antonio before the drought and the fever had taken it. He stood at the edge of the new northern pasture on the day the purchase was finalized and felt something move through him. Not the sense of restoration exactly, because this was different land and different cattle and a different man than the one who had first built a ranch, but something adjacent to it, a closing of something that had been open. He rode home and found Nora in the garden, which was what she was usually doing on an October afternoon, and he told her about the purchase, and she listened and then stood and dusted her hands on her apron and put her arms around him, right there in the garden, and he held on for a long time. "Does it feel like what you needed?" she asked. "It feels right," he said. "Different from the first time. Better, actually. I understand it more now." "That's because you earned this one differently," she said. "You started from nothing." "Almost nothing," he said. "I had you after a while." "After a while," she agreed, and her voice was warm with something that included a gentle tease and a genuine acknowledgement, the particular music of a long and close love. Eli, in 1885, turned 13, and was by that age a fully capable rider and a substantial help on the ranch, which he treated with the same serious investment he brought to everything. He was also, with Bernard Cole's quiet encouragement, a gifted student, particularly in mathematics and geography, and Bernard had begun to suggest, carefully, and with all the appropriate caveats, that Eli might eventually be well served by education beyond what Harvest Creek could offer. Gideon and Nora discussed this one evening, after the children were in bed. The idea of Eli going away for schooling was both hopeful and terrible in the way of all ideas that are good for children and hard for parents. "We'd manage the cost," Gideon said. "The ranch is carrying itself well enough." "It's not the cost I'm thinking about," Nora said. "It's him. He's 13. He's not ready." "No," Gideon agreed, "but he might be at 16, and we should be thinking about it." She nodded slowly. "I know, I just wish he didn't grow so fast." Gideon reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "He's going to be something remarkable," he said, "whatever he does." "He already is," she said firmly. They kept having the conversation, in the years that followed, at longer and longer intervals, and with increasing calm, as the idea of Eli's eventual departure became more familiar and less like loss and more like pride. In 1886, two things of note occurred. The first was that Samuel Pryor, the young Kansas hand who had been with them for 5 years and had grown from an uncertain 19-year-old into a dependable and skilled ranch hand, announced that he was going to marry a woman from the next town over and asked Gideon's opinion on this. Gideon told him his opinion, which was that marriage to the right person was the most useful decision a man could make, and that the quality of the decision depended entirely on whether the woman was as good as Samuel believed her to be, and that Samuel should verify this at length before committing. Samuel took this advice with the seriousness it deserved and married the woman in June, and she proved to be exactly as good as he had thought, and Nora made a point of inviting them to the Ford ranch for supper 3 times in the following year, and finding Emma Pryor to be a person she genuinely liked. The second event of 1886 was less domestic. A man named Walter Cray, who owned the largest ranch in the county, and had a history of absorbing smaller operations through a combination of legal pressure and financial maneuvering, sent a representative to the Ford ranch in August to make an offer on the property. The offer was fair, technically slightly below market, but fair, and the representative made it clear that Mr. Cray considered the offer generous given the direction of cattle prices and the general uncertainty of small operations. Gideon received the representative in the yard, listened to the offer completely, and then said, politely and with absolute finality, "Tell Mr. Cray that the Ford ranch is not available at any price, and that we wish him well in his operations elsewhere." The representative, who had clearly expected either acceptance or negotiation, looked slightly at sea. Mr. Cray would be willing to increase the offer. "I'm sure he would," Gideon said. But the answer would be the same. "Good day." The representative left. Nora, who had heard all of it from the porch, came down the steps and stood beside Gideon as the man rode away. "He'll try again," she said. "I expect so," Gideon said, "but the answer stays the same." She took his hand. "Good," she said. Cray did try again twice over the following 2 years, and both times received the same answer through correspondence, because Gideon did not allow a second representative through the gate. By 1888, Cray had apparently accepted the situation because the offers stopped. The Ford ranch remained the Ford ranch. James, at 7, was turning into his own particular kind of person, headstrong, in a way that was sometimes maddening and often impressive, with a stubbornness of conviction that came from both his parents and had been concentrated in him like a mineral. He was also funny, with a natural comic timing that he seemed entirely unaware of, which made it funnier. Clara, at 4, had decided that she was primarily interested in horses, and had made herself the devoted assistant of Vicente Santos, who had long since become a genuine and valued friend of the family, and who had the patience of a mountain with the small and determined girl who followed him everywhere asking why things were done the way they were. Vicente Santos, for his part, had declined several opportunities to move on to other operations, because the Ford ranch was, as he explained to Gideon once with characteristic directness, the only place he had worked where he was treated like a man who knew what he was doing. Gideon had received this with the discomfort of someone who has just been reminded that what he considers basic decency is not, in fact, universal, and had subsequently made sure that Vicente's wages reflected his actual value to the operation, which took a meaningful adjustment upward. In 1887, Eli turned 15, and Gideon taught him over the course of that summer everything he knew about cattle management, land reading, and the financial side of running a ranch: the ledgers, the market calculations, the relationship with the bank that Gideon now had on favorable terms. He did this deliberately with the intention of giving Eli a complete understanding of the thing that he would eventually inherit or walk away from, whatever he chose. One evening near the end of that summer, Eli said, "Did you always know you wanted to do this? Run land?" "Yes," Gideon said. "From when I was about your age." "Why?" "Because I'm not sure I do," Eli said. He said it directly, the way Nora said things, without performance. "What do you think you want?" Gideon asked. Eli was quiet for a moment. "I think I want to study law," he said. "I think I want to go to school for it." Bernard says there are good law schools, and that someone with my head for figures and argument might do well. Gideon looked at him for a long moment, at this boy who had handed him tools on a roof when he was 7, who had sat beside him listening to stories about arrowheads and the history of the land, who had become, without any ceremony about it, one of the people Gideon loved most in the world. "That sounds right for you," Gideon said. "You're not disappointed?" Eli asked. "No," Gideon said, and meant it completely. "The ranch will go to James and Clara, or they'll sell it and do something else, or we'll figure it out. The point was never to make you into something specific. The point was to give you what you needed to become whatever you actually are." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the understated emotion that was so much Nora's way of feeling things, "Thank you, Gideon." "Always," Gideon said. He told Nora that evening, and she sat with it for a while, the confirmed certainty that Eli would go, eventually, and then she said, "He told me 2 years ago that he was thinking about it. I've been working up to this conversation." Gideon stared at her. "2 years? He asked me not to say anything until he was sure," she said with complete equanimity. "You kept that for 2 years. He needed time," she said. "And he did get sure, didn't he? There was nothing to do with this but acknowledge it, which he did, and go to sleep, which he also did, with her head on his shoulder and the October wind going along the outside of the house, finding no way in." Eli left for his preparatory schooling in the autumn of 1889, at 17, with arrangements made through Bernard Cole's connections for a school in Austin that accepted bright young men from the frontier counties. He went with a trunk, a good suit that Nora had made, a letter of introduction from Bernard, and a formidable amount of advice from everyone in Harvest Creek, all of which he received with gracious patience. The morning he left, Nora held him for a very long time at the door of the house while James watched from the porch, and Clara, now 5, held the horse's bridle with an expression of deep importance. Gideon stood to the side until Nora stepped back, and then he shook Eli's hand. "Be honest," he said. "In whatever you do, don't try to be what the room wants you to be. That's a waste of what you actually are." Eli nodded. He had his mother's eyes, that clear creek water color. "I'll write," he said. "Often," Nora said. "Often," Eli agreed. He rode away down the road toward town and the train, and they stood watching until he was a small shape and then no shape. And then Nora turned and went back into the house, and Gideon followed her and found her in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table, looking at nothing, and he came and stood beside her, and she leaned against him without a word. "He'll be all right," Gideon said. "Of course he will," she said firmly. "He's extraordinary." A pause. "It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." "No," Gideon said. "It doesn't mean that." He wrote as promised. Long letters, detailed and thoughtful, describing the school and the city and the people he was meeting and the things he was learning. He came home for Christmas that first year and for every Christmas after, and each time he came back he was more himself, more certain of the direction, more at ease with who he was becoming, and each time he left again was a little easier than the last, because the leaving was clearly the right thing. The Ford Ranch in 1890 was a different thing from the 42-head operation of 1880. It had 320 acres, a herd of 200 head, 2 permanent hands in Vicent and Samuel Pryor, a kitchen garden operation that had grown into a genuine small business supplying 3 towns, and a reputation for producing well-managed, healthy stock that commanded a reliable premium at market. Gideon was 43 years old and Nora was 38, and they had built the thing together in the most literal sense. Every fence post and every preserve jar and every marketing decision and every difficult season had been a joint project, and the result was something that bore both of them in every part of it. James, at 9, had apparently inherited his father's love of land and cattle without the need for any persuasion. He worked beside Vicent every afternoon after school with a focused industry that made Vicent say, privately to Gideon, that the boy was a natural, that he read animals the way some people read words, intuitively and completely. This pleased Gideon in a way he tried not to make too obvious, because he did not want James to feel that his value was conditional on the ranch. Clara, at 6, had confirmed that her primary interest was horses, and had expanded this interest to include the opinion that the Ford horses were excellent but could be better, an opinion she was developing with the help of Vicent and a considerable amount of her own observation. She was going to be extraordinary with horses. Gideon could already see it. On an October evening in 1890, Gideon and Nora sat on the west-facing porch in the last of the sunset, which was the specific and outrageous pink and violet of a panhandle October sky, and they were quiet together, which was the particular luxury of people who have been together long enough to share silence without filling it. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Nora asked. "When you proposed, I offered you a direction," he said, "not comfort." "I've thought about that many times," she said. "Over the years, when things were hard, I would think about that you came to me honestly, you didn't dress it up." "I was terrified," he said. She turned to look at him, genuinely surprised. "You were, completely," he said. You are the person I most wanted to respect me, and I had very little to show." "You had yourself to show," she said, "and you decided that was enough." "It was more than enough," she said. "It was what I needed. I had been making do with practicality for 2 years, and then there was you, being honest about your situation and asking me honestly what I thought, and I thought, this is a man who trusts me with the actual truth." He reached across and took her hand, the way he had done at that kitchen table 11 years ago in the first November after he had arrived in Harvest Creek with nothing. "I was very lucky," he said, "that you were in Harvest Creek." "So was I," she said, "that you chose to stay." The stars were coming out over the panhandle, vast and uncountable, the way they were out here where there was no interruption between the earth and the sky. The cattle were settled in the pasture, a sound of movement and breath in the dark. James had gone to sleep an hour ago. Clara had gone slightly later, after the third request from her mother, and with the characteristic dignity of someone who is going to bed because she has decided to, not because she has been told to. Vicent's lamp was out in the bunkhouse. The whole wide country was quiet. "I love you," Gideon said, which he said regularly and meant every time with the same force as the first time, because it was simply true and there was no diminishing it with repetition. "I love you," Nora said, in exactly the same way, simply, directly, fully meant. They sat on the porch until the stars were fully out and the October cold made it impractical to stay, and then they went inside, and the house was warm and full of the specific domestic piece of a life that has been built with care, and the fire in the stove was banked for the night, and the children were sleeping with the deep, unconscious certainty of children who are completely safe. Gideon Ford, who had ridden into Harvest Creek 11 years ago with a borrowed horse and a name he could barely stand to carry, lay in the dark beside Nora Lawson Ford and thought about the particular road that had brought him here. The drought and the debt and the empty house in December and the months of traveling and the borrowed horse and the bruised sky afternoon and Tom the bartender saying, with his proprietary pride, "Good woman, widow." The well and the road and the kitchen table and the coffee and the dance in the October lantern light. The proposal which he had been so sure she might refuse and which she had answered with the same plainness with which she did everything. "It is agreeable." He had been brought to nothing, and nothing had asked anything of him, and he had remembered that every day since, when he had something worth having. He had tried to be, for everyone in his life, the thing that Nora had been for him in those early months, the person who does not make your worth conditional, who does not ask what you can provide before deciding you are worth knowing. He had not always succeeded, but he had tried, and trying had made him better than he had been, which was all anyone could reasonably hope for. He listened to Nora breathe beside him, the long and even rhythm of sleep, and thought that the most honest and important thing he knew was this, that you could not deserve a person like her. You could only be grateful and try to be worthy of the gratitude. He closed his eyes. The Panhandle night was enormous and dark and full of stars. 3 years later, Eli Ford came home from his law studies in Austin with a certificate, a practice arrangement with a firm in San Antonio, and a young woman named Helen, whom he introduced with a formality that lasted approximately 4 minutes before Helen asked Clara whether she could see the horses, and Clara took her hand and they went. And by the time they came back, Eli was talking to Gideon about the cattle prices and the rest was settled. The wedding was in the summer of 1894, in the same white church with the same donated bell, with Harvest Creek in its late summer fullness, 14 years older than the town Gideon had ridden into, more settled, more prosperous, with real glass in most of the windows and 3 new streets and a telegraph office, and the railroad extension that had eventually come through, 2 years late but functional. Tom the bartender, older and rounder and even more proprietary about the town's histories, attended and afterward said to anyone who would listen that he had known Eli was going to do something extraordinary from the first Sunday. The boy had complained about his mother's horse. Nora sat beside Gideon in the front pew of that church and watched her son stand at the altar with Helen beside him, and her face did the thing it had always done when something moved her. It went very still, very careful, the stillness of someone who is feeling a great deal and trusts the feeling but does not want to make a show of it. Gideon put his hand over hers on the pew, and she turned her palm up and gripped his hand, and they sat like that through the whole ceremony. Afterward in the churchyard, with the summer sun enormous and hot overhead and the whole town gathered, and the fiddle player already tuning up for the reception, James at 13 stood beside Clara at 9, and Clara was already talking to Helen's young sister about horses, and James was watching the crowd with the calm, interested gaze of a boy who is comfortable in his own company. Gideon stood with Nora, and Vicente Santos stood nearby with the kind of ease of a man who has been part of a family long enough to know exactly where he belongs, and Reverend Abrams, older now, hair fully white, shook their hands and said that in 30 years of ministry he had performed a great many weddings but never one that felt quite so much like the natural continuation of a good story. "Thank you, Reverend," Nora said. "That's a kind thing to say." "It's a true thing," the Reverend said. Kindness and truth usually come to the same place, given enough time. The reception went the way Harvest Creek receptions always went, long and loud and warm, with good food and the fiddle, and the particular joy of a community that has shared enough history to feel genuinely glad for each other's good days. Gideon danced with Nora, as he had at every dance for 14 years, and they moved the way they had always moved, not with the careful correctness of the first time, but with the ease of people who have long since stopped thinking about where to put their feet and simply gone where the music led. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, near the end of the evening, her head briefly against his shoulder. "Nothing specific," he said. "Everything." "The whole of it. Is it good?" she asked. He held her a fraction closer. "It's the best thing I ever built," he said. She looked up at him and the lantern light was in her eyes, and she looked at him the way she had always looked at him, that clear, assessing, warm look that had first caught him across a bar in the spring of 1879 and had never let him go. "We built it," she said. "We did," he agreed. The music played and the lantern swung in the evening breeze, and Eli danced with Helen across the square, and James asked one of the rancher's daughters to dance with a gravity that made Nora bite her lip to keep from smiling, and Clara stood at the edge of the dancing space with her arms crossed, clearly debating whether dancing was worth her time, and decided apparently that it was not, and went to find the horses. And Gideon Ford, who had once stood in an empty house in December with nothing but a canvas sack and a rifle, and the hollow certainty that he had failed, stood in the main street of Harvest Creek in the summer of 1894 with his wife in his arms and his family around him and his land full and good and worked and known, and felt the thing that is rarer and more valuable than triumph: the quiet, certain, permanent knowledge that the life he was living was entirely and exactly the right one. The stars came out over the panhandle as they always did. The fiddle played on. And Nora Lawson Ford, who had asked nothing of him when he had nothing to give, and whom he had been learning ever since how to be worthy of, leaned her head against his shoulder and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.